So you got two songs here. I don't know if you're putting it all together already, and that wonderful, amazing text. But you're putting together this idea of win in Rome, do as the Romans, or be sort of entrapped in what happens when you don't play along with the way of the norm, with sort of like the prevailing norm. What happens when we don't do that? And then the whole idea of how do we become alive in the world? How do we wake up in this world? And it is interesting too, because when you're in a place of privilege, it's hard to recognize that you're asleep. Number one, it's hard to recognize that because you feel kind of alive. You don't recognize the rest of the world that's caught in this turmoil lots of times. And then we find the tension on the opposite side of where we may stand, and we feel like, oh, I don't want to deal with that because if that's what alive is, then that means I got to get in the midst of conflict, and I don't want conflict. We're sort of conflict aversive for most of us. So we get stuck in this place of what does it really mean to be alive? What does it really mean to wake up? And what does this parable, for example, have to do with any of that? So I'm going to do a couple of things first. I want to tell you a very quick story just because it's one of my favorites. A lot of you know this one. A bunch of you don't. And it really illustrates well what I'm trying to get at. So the story of the guy who wanders into a town that he doesn't know very well. And he decides the best way to get to know a town is to walk into the local bar. It's a small town. He goes to the local bar, and he's going to find out who these people really are. So he walks into the bar, and then he has his first drink, looks around at the crowd in the bar, and then he says, "Every last one of you is a lousy Democrat." And then I told the joke wrong. Every last one of you. Oh, by the way, I'm gonna say a cuss word here, so kids don't get too excited. Every last one of you is every last Democrat. Let me back up here. So this guy, you'd think I'd know what I'm doing. I just went to a storytelling festival yesterday, and I've told this 100 times. Anyway, so a guy walks into the bar, and he wants to know what the people are like. And so he looks around after his first drink, and he says, "Every last Democrat has a horse's ass." And there's just dead silence in the room, and then suddenly they reach over, they grab the guy, and they throw him out, they beat him up, toss him out into the street. And after a minute, he gets his senses about him, he brushes himself off, and he says, "All right, I know what I'm dealing with." So he walks back into the bar, and he says, "Every last Republican has a horse's ass." And they grab him up just as quick, they beat him up, and they toss him out. And he's sitting out there in the middle of the street scratching his head trying to figure out what it is that he doesn't know who these people are. And some guy walks up and he goes, "What's up with you guys?" And the guy looks at him and says, "You don't understand, mister. This is horse country." Right? What do you take away from that? I mean, the reality is we live in a world that tries to think everything in terms of binaries. Everything in terms of binaries. And the really exciting truth, it's not the sad truth, the most exciting truth about the whole thing is that it's neither. It's both and it's all sorts of more than all of that. So challenge for us today is to think about how does seeing the world in the gray help us understand how to wake up into this world and to be more alive. So I'm going to get a little bit nerdy with this parable because it is a parable what we try to do is in the high seasons like Lent and Easter season and Christmas and Advent, we try to kind of do everything all together. The same text, whatever Lance Marshall, the senior pastor, whatever he decides to do, we're going to do it. Now we're going to do it different because like I said, we're sort of like, we kind of approach things askant, kind of from a different angle. And also because we're really trying to reframe for some of us that have kind of come through traditional, had difficult experiences in churches in the past. And so rather than throwing everything out with the bathwater, we have to recognize it's always more than all of that. And so in here we get a chance with open minds to kind of explore things. By the way, I don't know the answers, so just because I'm saying something, I could be all wrong. But I'm here exploring with you all at the same time. So we're going to get a little nerdy. Please bring up this next slide. So what you're looking at here is the source theory of the Gospels. Now the source theory says that there's multiple sources that we have no text for, we have no historical markers for. We just look at what the other Gospels have written in them and comparing the three synoptics, meaning the three similar ones, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and the other one, which is very different, John, and then looking at historicity and dating as best we can, which ones were the more recent, which ones were the oldest and closest to Jesus' time. And we look at all of that, and then we figure, wait a minute, there's material that's not similar with any of them, and then there's material that's only shared by a couple of them, and then there's material that's shared by all of them. John, of course, has almost very little of any of the other Gospels. He's written almost 100 years later after Jesus. So you have the three synoptics that are comparative. There's only two that show the story. Mark is considered one of the earliest Gospels. But there's these other two sources, Q and Thomas, Gospel of Thomas, where their oral traditions have been going on since maybe even right after the time of Jesus. And so this particular story is in Luke, and it's in Matthew. And then it's in the Gospel of Thomas. Now, I'm going to read you the Gospel of Thomas version. Remember the violence and the guy with the wrong outfit who gets thrown into gnashing and wailing and, gnashing of teeth. By the way, the guy says friend before he does that, which is interesting. A person was receiving guests. When he had prepared the dinner, he sent his slave to invite the guests. The slave went to the first and said to that one, "My master invites you." But that one said, "Some merchants owe me money. They're coming to me tonight. I'll have to go and give them instructions. Please excuse me from the dinner." So the slave went to another and said to that one, "My master has invited me." That one said to the slave, "I've bought a house and I have been called away for a day. I won't have any time." The slave went to another and said to that one, "My master invites you." And that one said to the slave, this is the third one now, "My friend is to be married, and I am to arrange the banquet. I shall not be able to come. Please excuse me from the dinner." So then the slave went to yet another one. This would be the fourth one. "My master invites you." And that one said to the slave, "I've bought an estate, and I'm going to collect on the rent. I can't come either. So please excuse me." So the slave returned and said this to the master, "Those whom you invited to dinner have asked to be excused." And the master said to his slave, "Then go out to the streets and bring back whoever you can find to have dinner." Is it different? It's just a little bit different, right? Nobody's getting killed. Nobody's getting angry because the servants came and they're going to kill the servants because, that doesn't really make sense in the first place. You're just inviting them to, they're just being invited to a party, so why kill the messenger, And then the guy that's not dressed appropriately also gets, thrown out into darkness. There's something about Matthew who takes this story and reappropriates it for the community he's talking to. But think about what's happened. Because if you're looking back at our nerdy chart here, you're seeing that in 70 A.D. is the fall of Jerusalem. Matthew's written about 2 decades after that. It's written sometime after the fall of Jerusalem. And so you've got this whole tradition now being reinterpreted in the context of everything you'd hoped for, your whole civilization has now collapsed and everybody's been scattered. And this Jesus was supposed to be the guy the Messiah who kind of pulled it all together and took over. And so now how do we interpret this? Matthew's got a little bit of anger issues going on. And you might not find that surprising, right? Especially if you're interpreting things as you're the chosen people and Jesus was the chosen Messiah and those people killed, Jesus, and now we're all scattered. So if you rejected him, this is what's going to happen. There's a bit of an anger thing going on. But there's also something else that we're being invited to with this parable, and that's what I want to think about. So allegory is the way that people tend to look at as Matthew as using this story as an allegory, not at all the way in which Thomas used it. The tradition around the Gospel of Thomas is actually this story that just says, all right, if you're not going to come, then we're going to invite other people to come. And whoever's willing to come to the party, that's who the party's for. The party's for everybody, and it's your choice if you're going to come or not. It's a whole different worldview, a whole different way of understanding how God relates to us. So in Matthew's Gospel, you've got the obvious. You've got the servants who are the missionaries. They're like the prophets that get killed. Then you've got the wealthy ones who refuse and end up killing the prophets, and those are the elite Israelites. They're not just every Israelite, but it's really more of that elite ruler group of Israelites, Sadducees and priests and such, who really kind of turned and had been colluding with the Roman Empire for the most part against even their own people, taxation and such. And so those people are considered the guests that were invited. And then you have the others who finally get invited, and those are the Gentiles. So Matthew is making a very clear statement here. But it helps us, I think, sometimes to understand how we get in these positions, right? How we find ourselves today in this same kind of reality. See this next picture here. I like this. Whatever happened to good old days? They were so much better when you were white and male, heterosexual, Protestant, cisgender, rich, Anglo-Saxon. Those were the good old days. Thank you for laughing. It's a little hard to see. I get it. I think this was what this parable is about for Jesus, because as he's returning to Jerusalem, this story that he tells in the Gospel of Thomas, in the earliest traditions, this story really is about what the whole point of his being here has been about, which is the beloved community that Martin Luther King talked about as well. The insight he came to at some point in his own struggle with oppression and addressing his oppressor as brother and sister. He really kind of came to this revelation that we are all part of this inextricable unity. We're all part of the beloved community. And how do we participate in that? But by seeing our enemies as part of us. So Jesus was speaking of the kingdom of heaven when he was telling this particular story. And who's going to see it? Who's going to begin to come to it and invite others to it? I mean, it's just open to everyone. No matter who you are and what side of the spectrum you are, it's open to everyone. Maybe it was because when we have the beloved kingdom, when people do come together around a meal, around compassion, around service, around helping one another, maybe when people do come together in that way, the polarities start to fall away. The binaries start to fade, and you find this other ground that you didn't see before because fear was taken over. And so we get in those defensive positions. There's this wonderful quote that Charles Johnson, I've got a couple of books here that I wanted to sort of recommend to you. Taming the Ox is a great book. It's written by an African-American scholar named Charles Johnson. It came out about 8 years ago. And it made me think of, Todd Kirk did a wonderful little sermon and talk in here, a sermon on the 10 ox herding images as a journey, as kind of an example, an analogy for a journey of faith. And so this is you would enjoy this book. He takes a different angle on it, though, but he's looking at kind of the spirituality that we find ourselves in this binary reality that we're in. And he talks about Martin Luther King. One of the things that Martin Luther King, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, and after the Voting Rights Act was passed, after the March on Washington, all of those things had come to fruition, and he'd even won the Pulitzer Prize in 1963. And so all of these things were coming together, and Martin Luther King is talking to his friend Bayard Rustin, and he begins to say, I don't know what my life is about anymore. Imagine that. You fought so hard for your people's rights, and it's such a struggle because you're going up against the binary, right? You're going up against this wall, and yet you've been able to enact this change, to inspire this change. And he's looking at himself, and he's looking at his community, and he's thinking about what's the next thing? I don't know what I'm all about. And then he realized that what he was about was this idea of the beloved community. This idea of helping us all realize we're all a part of the same reality. He actually went over and he visited with Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk that he nominated for the Pulitzer Prize himself. And he visited with him for a long period of time and came away realizing that part of the root of the problem that we've all experienced, that's in all of our anxieties about the other, no matter where we are, Republican or Democrat, it's horse country, right? It's above and beyond and in all of that. And he came away realizing that we are a part of this beloved community, and the only problem is some people don't see it. Some of us don't recognize it, that we're in this inextricable reality. As he said, we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. You remember that quote. But then he also added, when we get up in the morning, we go into the bathroom where we reach for a sponge which was provided for us by a Pacific Islander. The towel was provided by a Turk. We reach for soap created by a Frenchman. In the kitchen, you drink coffee provided by a South American, or tea by Chinese, or cocoa by a West African, and you butter your toast in that came from an English-speaking farmer. And before you finish breakfast, you've depended on more than half the world. This is our way in the universe. This is the way the universe is structured. It's the interrelated quality in which we live. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of our universe. If our destinies are so intertwined, it follows that, strangely enough, he said, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. Let that sink in your head for a minute. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. Now, I'm telling you that particularly as your progressive-minded person there sitting in here, and perhaps pretty strongly progressive to the left, or pretty central progressive, or maybe just kind of open-minded, or maybe more conservative and not really sure what you think about any of these things. And I'm suggesting to you that it follows strangely. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. Like Valerie Carr, that I've quoted so many times in the Revolutionary Love Project, the Sikh woman whose uncle or one of her family's best friends was the first person killed by a hate crime after 9/11. And she came out with this whole movement, the Revolutionary Love Project, and she was saying the important thing that we have to recognize is when we see the stranger, we have to remember to see that that's not a stranger, it's a part of us we don't know yet. That I can't be what I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. So, I want to tell you a quick story. Last week I told a heaven and hell story. This week I'm going to tell another heaven and hell story. A boy went to his rabbi and he asked his rabbi, what's the difference between heaven and hell? And the rabbi said, sit down, I'll tell you. Close your eyes and imagine that you're in hell. Just imagine this dark place. Hell is like this place where it's illuminated enough that you can see you're seated at a table, but when you look around, he said, keep your eyes closed. When you look around, you're going to see people seated all around the table. Now notice something in your imagination, he said. Everyone's arms are locked at the elbow. They have all this delicious food set from all around the world in front of them. They can't eat the food because every time they reach for the food in front of them, right there at their plates, they can't lift it to their mouths. The best they can do is try to throw it up in the air or hold it straight up in the air and let it fall into their mouths. It's terribly awkward, and the little boy was kind of laughing and smiling at the image, and he said, that's right. So look around the room, around the table, everyone's trying to feed themselves, and he said, that's what hell is. He says, okay, well, what's heaven? He said, well, close your eyes again. So he said, now imagine a place, still kind of dark, not real bright, you know. And he said, I thought heaven was real bright and light. He said, no. Heaven's not all that bright. He said, just close your eyes and you'll see. So he said, look around the table, you'll see all these people seated there. He said, now notice, everyone's arms are locked at the elbow, and they've got food from all around the world placed in front of them. But they can't eat it, because if they try to feed themselves, he said, wait a minute, Rabbi, he said, that was hell. He said, no, close your eyes, look again. So he said, now look around the table, and as you're looking around the table, you'll notice everybody with their arms locked at the elbows. They can't reach their own food, so instead they reach around the table, and they feed the person across from them. Now look at that, they're all feeding each other, because that's the only way they can do it. And he said, so what's the difference then? And the rabbi said, the difference is the people. The difference between heaven and hell is the people. So around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, there was also this movement for LGBTQ rights that was starting to come about. The Stonewall revolt that happened up in New York City at the club was a direct result out of this kind of civil rights movement. Because when you see one marginalized group starting to come to their own, starting to recognize their own voice and their own agency and their own right to be present, other people who feel marginalized and yet who know who they truly are begin to do the same. And so you have a person like this who comes, if we have this one coming up here in the next slide, Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha P. Johnson was a transgender woman who lived in New York, and she was a community activist. She was very much a part of the community in the late 1960s, standing up for LGBTQ rights, for transgender rights. This was 1968. In 1969, she got caught with a good friend of hers, Sylvia Rivera, who will come up here next. Sylvia Rivera, also a transgender woman, both of them very active in the community as community activists and community workers, also very much active in the LGBTQ rights movement. In 1969 was the Stonewall Revolt, right? The Stonewall Rebellion or whatever it was, where police came in, and I remember a couple of dozen or more people killed, a lot of folks arrested. In fact, Marsha herself turned up in the river about 3 months later. Some said it was suicide, but there's a couple of documentaries out there. It all looks very questionable, of course. And then Sylvia died of AIDS. She died of cancer 6 months or to a year after that anyway. So But the movement had started. The movement had started. Obviously it didn't go well. In 1972 in the United Methodist Church, somebody at the general conference meeting put forth a legislation out of nowhere and said, we ought to include in the Bible, in our discipline, which is like the Methodist Bible, we ought to include in our discipline this language that says the Methodist Church is not condone homosexual behavior and does not approve of ordaining or in leadership quality homosexual individuals. That's not the exact language, but that's the gist of what it was. 1972. You see what happened, right? If you're looking at the system, you see what happened. Because we operate out of binaries, it's so hard to wake up to our realities. We'd rather sleep and be stuck in the binary. And so there was the counter movement. When you have this movement for freedom, this movement for self-expression, this movement for people authentically coming to recognize who they are and to have a voice, somebody's going to be uncomfortable. And next thing you know, we've got this language that for the last 50 years has crippled the Methodist Church in different ways, and now we have the denomination finding itself in this disaffiliation kind of place. Thank God we're at First United Methodist Church, which is an affirming community, and will remain United Methodist, and here, affirming community, and here as we have been since 20 years ago when we got started. But the reality is this kind of tension always surfaces. And then we see the Me Too movement, and then we see Black Lives Matter. And we thought, well, feminist movement would have handled everything. But you see, there's this pushback, that constantly, this tension, that when voices get clear enough and it becomes present enough, we get scared. And we gravitate with our fear toward our tribe or toward a position. Left or right, we do it. It's horse country. We don't see the horses. We just go to our familiar territory and point our finger across the table or across the aisle. Then in 2018, we have Andrea Jenkins, black transgender woman in Minneapolis. Y'all know who she is? She's the first transgender woman to be elected to a large city's city council. So she serves on the city council in Minneapolis. Now, we don't see it because, well, some of us do. Some of us may be LGBTQ individuals. And we're sitting there thinking, wow, it's taken 50 years. But all right, we're making progress. But then you also see the legislation that's out there right now, right? All the anxiety, all the legislation, all the pushback. I was at the store the other day, at a grocery store, and I had this wonderful experience. Let's put this next one up there. It's one of my favorite images. The 5 stages of waking up. It's tongue-in-cheek, right? It's talking about waking up from bed. But no, it's not. It's talking about waking up. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Trust me, you never get to acceptance. You keep going back to denial and anger. Go ahead and keep it back up there, the cat one. Because I wanted to think about that for just a minute. I ran into somebody in the store, and I was there talking to my friend Miles, who works the Growler station over there. And Miles is a very progressive individual, very much on the left, and he's always been pushing me for years until he realized I wasn't that kind of Christian. Because he knew I was a pastor, and he knew what pastors were, and he knew what churches were, and he knew what Christianity was, and all of its insanity, and he realized that I was one of those, and so he was just throwing it at me. Like he threw it to every other right-wing evangelical that came for, beer and wine. And he said, don't worry, I'll keep it a secret, to those folks. But he looked at me, and we were both talking to an individual who was clearly on the right of the spectrum. And as we were talking, the guy looked at us, and he says, oh, wait a minute, are you guys woke or something? And I thought to myself, I know Miles was ready to come in there with all of his weaponry. He had his whole spiel lined up on how crazy the other side was. And I looked at the guy, and I said, I don't know if I'd call myself woke. He said, what about your congregation? They're all woke, those people, this 11-11 thing? And I said, yeah, I don't know. Waking up is really hard to do. And he looked at me for a second like, and then I said, but I'm serious, it is. It's kind of hard to do, waking up to things and trying to understand things. It gets scary, right? It feels threatening, it feels wrong, it's scary. And he kind of goes, yeah. And I was like, well, it's hard. Waking up is hard. I'm not sure if I'm awake or woke. I think I'm waking up, but I'm not sure. It's hard to do. And it was interesting because it literally just sort of shut the conversation down, but it didn't close it off. Because I know what that guy's going to be doing as he leaves later on. He's going to be thinking about, what is this waking up? What is that? Waking up is hard to do. We have opportunities all the time to sort of stand up, but not necessarily stand against, but stand in the midst of. And that's really what I think this parable is inviting. It's inviting us to stand in the midst of it. It's not night and day. It's dusk and dawn and everything in between. It's not right or wrong. It's everything in between. So how do we learn to stand in the midst of that? So here's this quote, and then we need to get the band on up here. So this quote, the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself can be interpreted in two ways. On one, it means treat your neighbor with the same love as you would want yourself treated. But on a deeper level, it means your neighbor is yourself. Love your neighbor because they are you. And that's the hardest thing, I think, for us, is to recognize that in whoever we're with, wherever we are, is to recognize that our neighbor is ourselves. When I was at the Storytelling Festival last night, Elizabeth Ellis was there. Some of you all remember Elizabeth Ellis. I'm going to try to get her to come over here one more time. She's an old woman. She's in her mid to late 70s. Just an amazing storyteller. To look at her is to think to yourself, I don't know that she'd have anything to offer me. And then as soon as she opens your mouth, you just want to sit down and go, can I call you grandmother? Can I just sit with you? And she was that way last night as I hadn't seen her in about 2 or 3 years. And I took Tim, because Tim grew up with her. My son, who's now 36 years old, grew up at all these festivals as I'd travel around the country with all these different tellers. And so it was just a wonderful moment to be there. And Tim was talking to her in private, and the two of them were talking, and then all of a sudden I overheard her say something. And I think she was offering it to him as he was thinking about what he's going to do next. Because Tim's always thinking about, what am I going to do next? I'm not really, this isn't enough. I want to do something else. You know, it's always the adventurer. He's a teacher now. He teaches over at Fafwa. Or Fwafa. But she said this. I want you to hang on to this. She said, you can count the seeds in an apple pretty easily. Did you know that? Just cut it open. You can count the seeds. You know what you can't count? Is how many apples come from one seed. We're all that seed. That's what we have an opportunity to do. We have an opportunity to be that seed, and as my uncle would say, leave the place better than you found it whenever we'd go camping. Leave the place better than we found it. How can we step into the gray area and be a part of this banquet that is life? Amen.